Today's video is about Bill C-8, one of the trifecta of bills recently put forward by the Canadian government that apparently might turn Canada into a police state. And I have to say at the outset, I'm feeling a little bit cynical because I'm kind of tired of everything being an existential crisis. Now, when it comes to the bill, as always, if you're looking for me to say, oh, it's all sunshine and roses, or oh, it's terrible, it really is going to turn us into a police state, you're not going to hear either of those things. Because like any bill the government puts out, there are some really good things and some very questionable things. I'm going to try to go through it today, but what I really want to do is sort of give context to, because I used to work in the government and specifically in security and intelligence, I read, policy documents that came from legislation every single day. There's some parts to what I see in the general media coverage that I think are really missing from the analysis. So to start off, the bill got this really long kind of, not really clear name, but it's essentially an amendment to the Telecommunications Act and acts that follow, and it's really meant to deal with cybersecurity. And it's meant to deal with cybersecurity on an infrastructure level. That's why it's amending the Telecommunications Act. It's not really looking to deal with cybersecurity on an individual threat actor level, which is why you don't see a lot about CSIS or the RCMP in this bill. So when it comes to infrastructure, I'm going to say right at the outset, although I'm a minute and a half in, I am really biased on this subject. Okay, I went into this bill, I really wanted it to be sunshine and roses. I spent the bulk of my security intelligence career in cybersecurity. And even what I saw 10 years ago, Canada, we need legislation like this, not exactly this, but like this desperately. Cybersecurity, even 10 years ago, millions of attacks coming in every single day against our critical infrastructure. And we don't have a comprehensive strategies like, okay, whatever, strategy. Who cares about strategy? I'm talking like implementation plan. And it has to be handled by the federal government, this one, right? This is not the kind of thing you want piecemeal. You don't want provinces and individual corporations making decisions about how they're going to do cybersecurity willy-nilly and not talking to each other. Because the thing about cybersecurity is you're all as vulnerable as your weakest link, right? So the idea is that you want to have a really robust, secure infrastructure so that the weakest link is actually pretty strong. So that, I think, was the intent behind this bill. But of course, that's not the part that anyone's talking about. And I'm frustrated, and I'm going to get into why I'm frustrated in a little bit. The first thing I want to remind everybody is that, and I do it sometimes too, I slip into this, the government, but actually the federal government is not like a monolith, okay? It's not just a thing. It's not one thing, the federal government. The federal government is made up of lots of departments and lots of agencies, and those entities exist because there is existing paperwork, legislation, orders in council, something that says this is what you are, this is the box that you play in, and this is what you're going to do. Right? You don't just so when we're talking about the government's going to do something, I find that sometimes that's okay, but in these situations, it's really important to actually talk about, well, who? What part of? Who exactly in the federal government is going to do this thing? Because it's not the prime minister, right? Who are we talking about here? And so when I started reading this Bill C-8, I really wanted to get at that. Where are the responsibilities lying? So I want to start with some of the good things about this bill. One of the good things is it's actually trying to come up with a consistent set of rules that critical infrastructure will follow in Canada when it comes to cybersecurity, whether it's privately owned, publicly owned, hybrid, no matter what province it resides in. And like I said, that is long overdue. And I think it's really, really important. So when I'm looking at the bill, I see that it is trying to stay initially, I understand there are problems with this, we'll get to that later, but initially it's trying to stay at the infrastructure level. Now, what does that mean, right? When it comes the government isn't going to tell a telecoms company to do XYZ. The government doesn't do that. So who in the government does that? Well, these days, a lot of the cybersecurity expertise is held by the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. Henceforth, in this video, I will call it CCCS. And it's an organization that grew out of CSC. It didn't exist when I was there. It exists now. I know people who've worked in it. And that's where a lot of the knowledge of the threat space as well as the solution space. That is where it's held. So it's actually the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity that is going to work with the provinces, with private organizations, the telecoms companies. That's who's probably, I mean, the bill doesn't explicitly say they're going to provide all the advice, but my guess is that's where a lot of it's going to come from, right? They're going to look at what's going on in the space and also the different, antivirus softwares, the different like malware things you can install to prevent attacks. They're going to look at all the tools that are available, and they're going to want to recommend the ones that are really good and the best for Canada. And the people that I know who work there are like incredibly smart, and I have no doubt that they're going to provide really thoughtful, solid advice on that. So I wanted to be clear about like who is doing that kind of advising. So that's where I think the main impetus of the bill comes in. Okay, that is really what it's designed to solve, is to make our systems of importance more secure. Now, I watched a lot of videos and read a lot of articles about issues with the bill. And it's not issues with the idea of improving our cybersecurity. There seem to be three main areas that people have issues with. So the first one is there's an incredibly high amount of fines that are, like right now, they're coming across as pure threat, right? Now, if you're Bell or Rogers, you're big, you got lots of people, you got lots of systems, maybe you can pay those fines. But the idea is that there is some criticism of the fact that we're going right to fine really quickly with this bill, and that maybe smaller telecommunications providers or ones that maybe service more rural communities where the infrastructure is a bit older, they aren't going to have the capacity to immediately implement what the advice is, and those costs will be passed on to consumers, and there's not a lot being talked about in that space. And actually, that's a criticism I happen to agree with, and I didn't see as much on that one, right? So I think that needs to be thoughtfully implemented. Now, the next thing I want to say in terms of how the government works, because it's really relevant, especially to the next points, you don't have a bill and then workers executing actions and with nothing in between them, okay? There are a lot of things in between those two groups. The bill and the worker, you have this policy suite, and policy is not optional, okay? When you have a policy document, I don't care where you work in the government, agriculture, CSIS, environment, the office of the poet laureate, it doesn't matter. If you have a policy, it is mandatory. So what happens is the bill comes out, the legislative changes are made. There's an entire suite of documents that follow from those legislative changes that give you the details of how it's meant to be executed, okay? That's really, really important. So sometimes I see criticisms of bills where it doesn't say how it's going to be done, because that's not what a bill is supposed to do. Now, if you want to understand how things are done, you just go look at the policies that are out there already. You'll see it's fairly comprehensive. And it also includes like chains of command and chains of approval. So like, for instance, I know when I worked at CSE has this mandate called Mandate C, which is that under certain specific conditions, they can help CSIS or the RCMP. Well, they can't just go do that, right? That requires, and the policy documents set out all the layers of approval. So one of the things that I see people really criticizing with this bill is the idea that the government, so who in the government, we'll talk about that in a second, could recommend, because they now will have, if the bill goes through, and by the way, it's finished its second reading, it's now in committee where they're hearing expert testimony on all sorts of aspects of it, which is probably going to produce some changes. But the idea that then the government could push out to telecommunications companies, you must use this software. And there's groups who are concerned that one of the pushes is going to be for inferior encryption software, so that the government has a backdoor to get into telecommunications companies because they have already cracked that encryption. So let me tell you something, and this is a constant tension across the world, everywhere you go, when it comes to encryption. The people who are interested in the activities of individuals, like criminals or terrorists, they're the ones who tend to be more supportive of the backdoor thing, right? They kind of like the idea of, if it were possible and we could make it all good and civil liberties, I don't know, warrants, judicial oversight, whatever, that there would be these backdoors that they could go in and access information about individuals for criminal cases or terrorist investigations. However, the tension is the people who are responsible for securing the systems, the cyber defense people, they don't like backdoors, right? Because a backdoor for one person is a backdoor for everyone. So the idea that the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity would recommend an inferior encryption software so that outside of the confines of this bill, the RCMP could just go and access backdoors. I struggle with that. Okay, I struggle with that. Now, I know people are going to tell me it's possible, and yeah, okay, technically it's possible, but can you imagine you got the Minister of Public Safety in the room and the Minister of National Defense, right? And the Minister of Public Safety is like, wow, okay, I'm not saying he says this, okay? I'm just saying hypothetical scenario here. He says, we need these back doors so we can go do these terrorist investigations. And the Minister of National Defense is like, wait a second. We're not defending the country if we install inferior encryption software or create these backdoors. We're in fact making our critical infrastructure less secure. We are increasing the national security threat. Those would be really intense conversations. And this is why it goes to my original point about the government. In these situations, it's not that useful because it's not the government. There are differing positions within the government, and there's different organizations with different needs and different agendas. The other really important thing to remember about all departments in the government is that one of the things that a bill does is it talks about the legislation that it's going to amend. The assumption, the implied thing is that if it doesn't amend a particular piece of legislation, that legislation still stands. Okay? Just because, let's say, this legislation doesn't talk about RCMP warrants doesn't mean that in the context of this bill, RCMP warrants don't apply. The assumption, it's implied that the RCMP will continue to follow all of their legislative and, criminal code requirements regarding warrants. They will continue to follow the charter, and that's really important too, right? The charter still applies. Don't forget that. Now, it is possible to go extreme conspiracy theory and say that we're blowing apart the charter, and I don't think that that's true. There is charter analysis that happens with every bill, but yes, the charter analysis has to happen because without the charter, now that's maybe when we would get into a police state. But in any case, in the reality here is that the charter still applies to this bill. So this gets into the third point, and I know we're 13 minutes in, so if you've made it this far, oh my God, congratulations. The main thing that people seem to be really, really concerned about is, and I saw lots and lots of coverage on this, that the government could use this legislation to suppress political dissent because there is a provision, and it's weird, it's in section 50.2 or something, that the government can ask telecommunications providers to kick people off the internet and then have some non-disclosure and not tell them why. So there's this scenario I saw, okay, I got some sun here. You got some political dissent, you've been dissenting, and then the government's gonna say, well, we don't want you to dissent, so we're gonna stop your internet account. And then you go to use the internet and you can't get it, and your ISP says, well, I'm not telling you why, and no ISP will give you an account. So I want to, again, let's talk through who does this, because it's certainly not the government. Okay, so political dissent, RCMP, CSIS maybe, okay, so those two organizations, they got the Minister of Public Safety ahead of them. Now, according to the bill, the minister who can go to the telecommunications companies, at least my understanding of what I read, is the Minister of Industry. So what would have to happen is, the RCMP or CSIS has a list of I don't know, pick a number, 500 people that it says, we don't like what they're saying. This is political dissent. We don't like it. They go up the chain and they give it to their Minister of Public Safety, and he walks over to the Minister of Industry and he's like, hey, can you get these 500 accounts canceled? And she says, like, okay, let me check with my lawyers because this is weird. And if they come back to Bill C-8, there's no reason, there's no justification to put these 500 people out of the internet, because Bill C-8 is about protection of critical infrastructure. It's about the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. Political dissent doesn't have anything to do with securing your systems from a cyber perspective. So I thought, okay, why is this in here? Now, okay, like, you can fight with me all you want about the political dissent. I guess, like, there's a small, tiny probability that these things could happen, but let's just, I really, that's the one I'm really struggling with. I don't see it. I'm not saying that political dissenters can't be suppressed in other ways. I'm just saying I don't think this bill is the gateway to the suppression of political dissent, okay? So why would they put this in, right? I'm reading this and I'm like, okay, why would you even have this provision for taking down individual accounts in what is supposed to be an infrastructure bill, or a bill that deals with critical infrastructure? So, the mind goes back all the way, and I'm thinking, like, okay, the other thing I think a lot of people maybe don't understand is that bills are, if not full out written by, they are definitely vetted by lawyers for the government in working for Justice Canada. And these lawyers develop specialties. So when I was at CSE, we had our own set of lawyers, and they were lovely people. And I'd be up in their offices, honestly, once every 2 weeks, being like, okay, I'm not really understanding this provision and how it plays out in policy with regards to this new tool we're using. So we'd sit and we walk through it. It's really great in terms of helping to interpret what's already there. But sometimes I find that these kinds of things get written with certain situations and circumstances in mind, and they don't really maybe think about how else it might be interpreted. So I think that this provision for individual takedowns at telecoms providers is really more about bots, because it's really about cybersecurity, right? So it's like, yes, there are some pieces that, like, software that is problematic, but there's also problematic people, often foreign adversaries when it comes to cybersecurity, who have accounts in Canada that are are attacking our critical infrastructure. My guess is that that's what it was about. Now, because this video is already incredibly long, I'm just going to sum up with my final point, which is that the one thing I'm really, really angry about is, like I said, I spent years working on cybersecurity files. And Canada needs a comprehensive, actual, detailed action plan on how to protect our critical infrastructure for cyber. We need it desperately. What really, really upsets me about this is that for a bill that I think, probably is like 90% great, it's the focus is not on what's great about it. And we're getting to these extreme scenarios that I'm not even really sure apply. And the government is silent. Or at least if they're defending this, I can't see where, because I went deep. I didn't just stop at like the first, 3 hits in my search. Like, I went 10, 20, 30, 40 down. Where's the government response? And I have to wonder, like, who is doing communications for the Minister of Public Safety, which is the one who put this bill forward? The Prime Minister's office. Like, read the room, right? All Canadians are watching what's happening in the world. We're watching what's happening to the United States right now. And it's scary. And we're watching civil liberties just go poof. So even if your intention is not to override civil liberties, recognize that people are concerned about it. All you have to do for a bill like this is, as you're drafting it, or once like the first draft is complete, get some really credible civil liberties groups in the room. Just get them in the room, put the bill out to them and say, what are your objections to this? Where are you going to see difficulties? Where are your concerns? Pre-address them. Because if the government, the minister of public safety, the person who tabled this bill, but obviously the office underneath him, if their intention is not to silence political dissenters via a cyber infrastructure bill, say that. Have that as part of your communications plan. Make some amendments, or if the amendments can't really go in because of legal reasons, have it come out with your comms package. No, this is, if you're thinking it's going to go in this direction, this is not how it's going to go because of all these other rules, because of the charter. Because you know what? We still have charter rights. They're not going anywhere. And if this bill has to follow the charter, which it does, you're not going to get your internet account deleted. Do you know why? Because it would be a charter violation. It's section 7 or section 8. They can't seize your digital identity. That's a charter protection, right? So just address this stuff ahead of time. Anyway, this is an incredibly long video, maybe the longest I've ever made. If you have any questions or comments, if you've made it to the end, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope everyone's doing wonderful.